go. Okay, do you guys see my slides?
Yes.
All right, so let's get going. Well, thanks everyone. I'm glad to see some old friends. It's been a long time, and also new people. So welcome. I'm zooming to you from Rome, Italy. It's 7 o'clock here, and today we are going to talk about eco-justice and decolonization with EcoMedia Literacy. And I'll be presenting the first piece of this, and then we'll have Jeff share, and then Theresa Redmond to finish off. And what we tried to do when we structured this was to keep our talks really short so that we could have a long discussion. We felt like having a discussion would really be fruitful. So we're going to do our best to keep our talk within half an hour and then save the rest of the time to have a dialogue. And the other thing I wanted to mention to you is that you'll see there's a reference to the Journal of Education for Sustainability, a Journal of Media Literacy, which Jeff, Teresa, and I co-edited this year, and it's full of amazing articles about eco-media literacy. And Jeff has put links to those journals in the chat, so please feel free to check that out and read some of those articles. Just a polite reminder to pause your I'm sorry, mute your audio, and we'll get going. Okay, so what I'm going to present on is decolonizing the Anthropocene, an eco-media literacy analysis. And I want to start by defining what the Anthropocene is. It's a term that people probably have been hearing quite a bit. It's been used for conferences, for journals, for books. And what you need to know is that it comes out of the field of geology. And it references the idea of the age of humans, that we're in a new geological epoch in which humans are the primary force that are changing the planetary geology. It was coined by Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer in the year 2000. And it's important to understand that it is situated within the discipline of geology. So just keep that in mind. And it's currently what they're debating is what are called the golden spike, which is what is the moment that they actually start the idea of the Anthropocene. So the three candidates for the golden spike are the quote unquote exchange of flora and fauna resulting from the conquest of the Americas, B, the industrial revolutions, in particular the steam engine, or three, nuclear testing. So one thing that's missing from a lot of the discussion about the Anthropocene, and especially geology, is that geology historically is connected to colonialism, because geology, of course, is a science that you need in order for mining and extraction. And what these geological discourses ignore when people talk about the Anthropocene is those colonial roots of geology. And it's also important to recognize that mineral wealth is at the root of modern capital, so that the current reality that we're living in has a direct connection to this legacy of colonialism and mining in particular. In terms of media, the relationship between geology and media has to do with how our devices are made. So this is just a little montage of images about the various different ways that that extractivism connects to our media gadgets. So on the upper left, you see some lithium mined in Bolivia. You have in the middle uh, conflict minerals that are being mined in the Congo. You have an oil spill in Ecuador in the far right. You have copper mines, gold mining, and then mega projects like dams to produce energy. All these things are connected to our devices. And I want to make sure that as media literacy educators that we understand why we're talking about this. One important concept that's emerged in recent years is this idea of slow violence, which is violence wrought by climate change, toxic drift, deforestation, oil spills, and the environmental aftermath of war taking place gradually and often invisibly over time. So a lot of the violence that's caused by these extractive practices are not always necessarily visible in the moment that they're happening, that the effects of them take place over time. And, global warming, global heating, these are things that we are certainly feeling now, but the more acute effects of those are going to definitely be happening later on what is called the time horizon, the next 20, 30 years. So usually the Anthropocene is framed as a problem of man's behavior, but what that discourse ignores is the role of racism and slow violence, which is often is unseen when people talk about the Anthropocene. So the critique of the Anthropocene concept, there's several. I'm just going to give you a very brief summary here. One is that it's biased towards modernity as the privileging agent of change. What that ignores is that humans have always been changing the environment. In fact, there's evidence lately that demonstrates that the Amazon has been essentially uh, uh, shaped by the presence of humans over thousands of years of pruning and planting, and that it was not a virgin forest the way that it's often depicted when the Europeans arrived. The same is true with much of North America. California was a landscaped environment. It was not just raw virgin land as represented in the past. Um, so if the situation with the environment, the environmental destruction in the Anthropocene discourse is often attributed to men being men. This is somehow human nature, but it doesn't identify the particular systems that are destroying the land or destroying the environment. And also, when they talk about Anthropocene and the age of men, it's really problematized who are the we when they discuss human as a whole. This concept is generally undifferentiated. In fact, it ignores women, indigenous people, and frontline communities who are mostly dealing with the effects of extractivism. And in fact, this is a statistic some of you may have seen in recent years. Oxfam did this report and showed that the richest 10% of the global population cause 50% of global emissions. So it's not evenly, the causes of the Anthropocene are not evenly distributed, and the effects of the Anthropocene are also not evenly distributed. It's a very uneven distribution of both causes and effects. So the summary of the critique is, by the way, one thing I've been doing throughout is on the slides, I've been throwing up images that are represent how the Anthropocene has been represented in the media, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the Anthropocene totalizes the effects of colonization, but it erases its origins. And by ignoring slow violence, it reproduces the problem it claims to be addressing. So the method of analyzing this problem is one that I've been working on developing called EcoMedia Literacy. On the right, you see this is my new book. It's coming out in the end of November, which goes into much more depth into this method of analysis. But I just want to give you an overview. First of all, is the concept of ecomedia, which is media is understood as a part of and about the environment. So this is a little kind of a twist on how we normally think about media. And then EcoMedia Literacy combines tools from like critical media literacy and ecomedia studies, which is this emerging field that analyzes the ecological and environmental relationship between media and the environment. The way that I talk about ecomedia literacy, I talk about media as being objects that we can analyze, ecomedia objects. And there's 4 different types. I list them here: representational media text, platforms, gadgets, and hyperobjects. And a hyperobject would be a sort of amorphous distributed phenomena. And so here I'm treating the Anthropocene as like a hyperobject. And the Anthropocene really cannot be represented, but it is represented in sort of small ways in different types of text. I hope you can understand the difference there. So if you're going to perform an ecomedia literacy analysis of the Anthropocene, these are kind of questions you might want to ask, like how is the human represented? How is colonization and slavery represented? Or how is it absent, as the case might be? How is modernity represented? And how are the boundaries between society and nature represented? And here on the right side, you see a cover of Nature magazine, which is, you know, one of the most important science magazines. And this is one of, it's an illustration, but it's trying to represent the idea of the Anthropocene. And it's been fairly criticized because, of course, here the representation of man is, it's a white man if you look closely. And not only that, uh, what you see here is the Anthropocene is to be represented as sort of a white masculine modernity. If you look, there's like tiny little representations of Africans as slaves, and they're just sort of overwhelmed and dominated by this image of man. So in this case, once again, humanity is undifferentiated. I also want to point your attention to this sort of common illustration that we've seen in classrooms growing up. I think everyone has seen these on their classroom wall. We kind of internalized this idea of evolution and development from primitive state to sort of an advanced humanoid who happens to be a white man. And so I also think that these kind of discourses are represented in when we talk about globalization and the discourse of development. And I think all these are entangled in when we talk about the Anthropocene. So you may have you saw this image earlier in my first slide. This is from Smithsonian. This is kind of a typical image of how Anthropocene is represented. Here you have a geologist. He's overlooking the land. He's a scientist, and it sort of repurposes or re-represents some of these common mistakes or these common maybe ingrained ideological beliefs of the Anthropocene, where you have the low liberal subject. He's individualized. He controls and he possesses the environment through his gaze. This is also very much part of a Western visual culture. And the most important point that I want to make is that in this geological discourse, it's the Anglosphere of man who's the totalizing authority to determine the discourse of the problems and then sets the terms and conditions of the response to the Anthropocene. In other words, if geology is defining the Anthropocene, they're also defining what the problems of the response are. And that excludes a vast majority of the population that's affected by the Anthropocene. The other problem with these images is that they tend to be very abstract, and they obscure the role of corporations. You can't see the structural causes of environmental destruction are not, you can't really represent them very clearly, and they're not represented in these types of images like satellite imagery, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, what is absent are people most affected by climate disruption, most typically frontline communities, poor communities, et cetera. So I'm almost finished here. I have two images. I have the one on the right that we talked about from Nature magazine. The one on the left is the cover of Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. Leviathan is sort of a starting point of modernity, where they start to define people as separate from the environment, society is separate from the environment. You see in the image of the king, those are all those little bumps you see are people. This is the beginning of the separation of humans from nature, and we're sort of living in that world. We're living in the paradigm that modernity created. So in closing, I just want to say that we could use some alternative concepts. Instead of the Anthropocene, we could use the term the age of corporate activities. We could say the Capitalocene. We could say the petrocapitalist Anthropocene or the colonial Anthropocene as a way of reframing and rethinking about how we talk about this. Okay, that's it for my portion. I'm going to jump off here, and Jeff will be next.
Great, thank you so much. That was fabulous. I'm going to jump on. Let's see. And let me share my screen. Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint? Assuming you can see it. Can you see it? Could someone unmute and let me know if you can see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I want to start by just, oops. Well, hang on, I'm sorry. Here we go. I'll start with the metaphor of the iceberg that Robert Ferguson uses to talk about the way most people interact with media. And typically we just look at the denotation of the text and just what's sticking out of the water when we're listening to music or watching a video or engaging with social media. And we rarely go down beneath the surface to question and look at the context that surrounds all media text. And the reason he says this is so important is because we need to be asking questions about ideology, economics, history, politics, power, all of that, because we live in a world with a lot of problems. And if we don't look and try to analyze the context within which our media is coming and within which we're engaging with the text, we're not going to be able to have a deep understanding of what's really going on and see the structures and systems. So Faith Rogo uses this wonderful little equation where she talks about text and context is what gives us the message. And it's so important that we question and we look at the context as well as the text, which is something that a lot of teachers miss when they put all their emphasis in just, decoding that one text. Look at the textbook, come up with the answers, and forget about engaging and questioning the context. So this is what I want to do in terms of our relationship. If we look at our relationship with the natural world. Thinking about this, Naomi Klein says, up until the 1600s, the earth was seen as alive, usually taking the form of a mother. Europeans, like indigenous people the world over, believed the planet to be a living organism full of life-giving powers. So there was a time when everybody referred to the earth as Mother Earth. It was something sacred to be respected. But things changed. And so if we look at this quote from Sir Francis Bacon, who's considered the father of the scientific revolution, he says, nature is to be put in constraint, molded, and made, as it were, new by art and the hand of man. So this really gets at what Antonio was just talking about, this separation of humans from nature. So what we need to do is start questioning why, what happened to our language, what happened to our ways of thinking. And that's where I think we need to look at some of these contextual ideas I have listed here. The role of Christianity, capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, the scientific revolution, the age of enlightenment, and the industrial revolution. All of these have shaped the ways that we think about the world and about our relationships with nature. So if we look at this image, this is Pan, the ancient Greek god of nature. He has horns, beautiful horns, wonderful little hoof feet. Who does he remind you of? Well, if we think about horns and hoof feet, there's a very distinct relationship, right? By the end of the first millennium, the Christian church used the image of Pan to symbolize the devil. This changed the past of living in harmony with nature to a new fear of nature that supported the belief in one celestial God separated from the physical world. So it's no accident that we've developed, when I say we, I'm referring to kind of white European dominant US thinking and ideologies, that there is this real distinct separation of humans from nature in a way where it's really humans above nature, and nature is no longer something to be respected and live in harmony with, but something to control and to commodify and to use and exploit. This is no accident. So colonialization was based on this. Colonialization involves a process of classifying, categorizing, and naming, all the things that Antonio just talked about geology, right? This is what colonialists did and still continue to do. This is a dehumanizing process, and it's really key that we recognize the role of dehumanization in this process of colonialization, which turned people and things into objects and commodities that could be controlled and exploited for the benefit of white Europeans. So when we think about the benefit of white Europeans, what was going on with colonialization? Colonialism not only separated people from nature, it also created the idea of separate human races, right? The scientific revolution and enlightenment provided these rationales, scientific proof or evidence, I'm using those words in quotes, right? For believing that white Europeans are better than all others. So not only did it invent race, but it invented white supremacy. And what we have today is the legacy of all that. Part of this legacy is understanding the doctrine of discovery. So a year after Columbus landed in the New World, the Pope in the Vatican in 1493 issued the papal bull that asserted land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers. So the language of this papal bull stated the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere, increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. So we're looking at this hierarchical change in our relationship with nature and also our relationship with each other. The notion that if you're not Christian, you're lesser than and you should be dominated and subjugated and exploited. Along thinking and looking at the role of this doctrine of discovery from the 1400s, in the formation of the United States, the Articles of Confederation addressed US relationships with Native Americans and their land, and it was all based on the principles of the doctrine of discovery. Even Thomas Jefferson used this to justify the Louisiana Purchase, the Lewis and Clark expedition. All of this was based on the notion of the doctrine of discovery. In 1823, the US Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Marshall's opinion in the unanimous decision that gave the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands. So in the ruling, it denied Native Americans the legal right to own their own land, leaving them only with the, quote, right of occupancy, unquote, which the government even had the right to ignore and extinguish. So these ideas that started well back, well over 1,000 years ago, from Christianity to colonialism to this papal bull from the 1400s, are now embedded within our actual laws in the United States. And so at one time was this ecological worldview, where we saw our relationship and our reciprocity connections with nature, has turned into this very anthropocentric, like Antonio was describing, worldview where humans are at the top. And it's not just humans, but it's men at the top, then women, then animals, and plants, and the minerals, all the way going down a hierarchy of power. So what I want to come back to, and I think this is one of the things I take away a lot from Antonio's work, is how important language is. And it really matters. So last year, if we look at what the Guardian newspaper did, they changed their style guide and they said, we're no longer going to refer to climate change as climate change. And we're going to now call it what it actually is. It's a crisis. It's an emergency. So every time they refer to what's happening with our climate, they write about it as a climate crisis, climate emergency. It's not global warming, it's global heating. Language matters. Robin Wall Kimmerer writes some wonderful work in the book Braiding Sweetgrass. I highly recommend. She says, when a language dies, so much more than words are lost. Language is a dwelling place of ideas that do not exist anywhere else. It's a prism through which to see the world. So when we're talking about language, we're not just talking about single words, but we also are talking about words. But these words matter because they're used in context of what creates our epistemological way of seeing and thinking of the world through the stories, the words, the grammar, the syntax, all the ways that language functions. I want to share with you a couple words from indigenous languages. This word Aini. Indigenous communities in the Andes engage in relationships based on Aini, or ongoing cycles of reciprocity to exchange comparable work or goods. Aini is a core value that has served generations of Andean people since pre-Inca times. Aini helped the Inca accomplish monumental projects, such as a system of water management for their vast empire and diversified agriculture to feed millions throughout the Andes. In this rugged landscape, the age-old concept of Aini, which is reciprocity, is still very much alive. Language matters, and if we don't have the words to name it, how can we do anything about it? How do we understand it? Here's another example. These two photographs were taken by students of ours when my wife and I were teaching a media literacy course in an indigenous community in the mountains of southern Mexico. And our students for this project were photographing to illustrate the word tequio. Tequio is a word from Nahuatl, the Aztec language, that refers to collective work or tribute for our community. It has high moral significance in indigenous communities in Mexico. Engaging in tequio is honorable for its members as well as being understood as a moral obligation. It's one of the occasions to meet and work together and identify and build a sense of community. In education, Barbara Rogoff talks about community of learners. There's a lot of power in community, and it's an important way of recognizing each other's value and our relationship and our ability to contribute to society. So this notion of tequio is a very different concept than if we think about, what in the US we typically refer to as, giving to your community. Often it would be taxes. And yet taxes, what do we think about that? I mean, our president even says only stupid people pay taxes. It's a very different relationship to each other, to our community, and to the land. And I want to share this from a friend, Lehua Hawkins, in Hawaii. Here's what she says about the spirit of aloha.
The spirit of aloha is multidimensional. It is an action word that takes many forms. There is a Hawaiian proverb which says, "O ke aloha aina ke kuleana I ka koa po." Love for the land is our privilege and responsibility. Hawaiian epistemology has a deep appreciation for richness and fullness of life beyond linear thinking. Hawaiians have a deep respect for all life forms, from the heavens to the earth to the land to the sea. All of these things are our ancestors, for whom we have deep aloha for. All living things, seen and unseen, have a spirit and consciousness. When we say aloha aina, we are acknowledging our connection and respect to the land and its people.
So indigenous groups around the world continue, many of them with their language that carries with them this deep wisdom and connection to the land.
The spirit of aloha.
There you go. So if we thinking about media images and a media text, here this photograph is my media text. Based on all the context that you bring with you, that you've learned, that's associated, right? Because we're always making sense of messages through both the text and the context. What is the word that comes to your mind when you look at a picture like this? Do you see trees? Do you see the forest through the trees? When you look at this picture, do you see timber? Or when you look at this, do you see Mother Earth? That matters. And that's why it's so important in critical media literacy that we question and analyze the context as well as the text. So I want to end with this final quote from Four Arrows. He says, "When one lives in such a way as to see a tree as a relative rather than a resource, diversity inclusion as relates to fellow human beings follows." All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And I'll jump in now with the last piece of our presentation before we move into discussion. And just give me a minute to get my sharing set up. Okay. All right. Here we go. And I don't have the chat window open right now, so if there are comments in the chat, feel free to make those comments and I'll catch up after I present. So in this session, a segment of the session, I'll look at practice, EcoMedia literacy and practice. All right. When I encountered Antonio's book, Greening Media Education in 2014, I had been teaching an undergraduate media literacy course, and his work was my first experience with EcoMedia literacy, but yet so much of it made sense. And reflecting on my own incorporation of planned and perceived obsolescence into my course, EcoMedia literacy made the next logical step. And so I have two questions that I want to address in my practice. What opportunities exist in media education to decolonize curriculum, specifically by addressing the Anthropocene through EcoMedia literacy? This decolonization of curriculum is not only about the content we include in a media literacy course, but also about our pedagogical practices. So my second question is, how do media educators incorporate EcoMedia literacy into their curriculum? What pedagogical practices might media educators use to engage students? And EcoMedia literacy, as Antonio shared in his presentation, involves some very heavy theoretical ideas, in addition to some very heavy realities related to people and planet and the eco-racism that exists in those marginalized spaces where extraction occurs. And so the pedagogy is important, particularly in a course where students could become alienated by a resistance to wanting to engage with that kind of difficult content. And so EcoMedia literacy in action, what is my context? I teach a 3-credit semester-long media literacy course that meets twice per week for 75 minutes. It will shift in the spring to 3 meetings a week for 50 minutes each. The course is generally taken by undergraduate students who are doing a media studies minor. That's a campus-wide minor. And so as one of 2 core courses in the minor, students might take it their first year, their sophomore year, or senior year. So I have students from all ages and levels, in addition to all majors, including education, visual arts, electronic media and broadcast, journalism, public relations, advertising, and more. The classes that I incorporate on EcoMedia Literacy generally are 4 or 5 of those 75-minute sessions in the middle part of the semester. And I specifically seek to enhance their engagement and participation using social constructivist pedagogy. And lately, I've gone back and identified how my activities fall into the skills of a participatory culture. So Jenkins and his colleagues identified 11 skills of participatory culture that I'll show you in this next slide. They've added to this now the skills of visualization, and I would add to these the skills of embodiment, of access, and of empathy. And those come up a little bit in my activities. So I'll go through the activities now and identify how they embody these skills of participatory culture to create a bridge for students to actively engage with eco-media literacy in the Anthropocene. So the first activity that I do is the singer-songbird activity, where students are invited to stand up and shout out the name of the singer or the songbird as I play these slides rather quickly for them. All of these birds are local to Western North Carolina, where I'm presenting to you from, in addition to being widespread throughout the United States, Canada, and some are migratory songbirds, so they may even extend further into the Southern Hemisphere. In addition, these singers are recognizable by my millennial population. This activity involves multitasking, and I take multitasking and extend it here to encompass the ability to scan one's environment, which is what Jenkins and his colleagues identify, and to shift your focus to salient details. And so my hope is that I encourage students to think about looking at their environment more closely, to pay attention as they explore campus, as they move between classes. So that example is one of multitasking. In addition to the slideshow, we will work with audio. So I'll ask my students, after they've generally failed to identify the songbirds and been able to identify very quickly the singers, I will play sound clips for them from songs in popular media in addition to local birds. Can you hear this bird? Does anyone know this bird? This is the Carolina chickadee, and the Carolina chickadee comes from a number of songbird species that are actually throughout Europe as well. And so we have this common species that is so often missed because our multitasking doesn't take into consideration the physical environment. We'll use that as a hook, and then we'll dig into some more intense work where students will explore a variety of media objects, as Antonio had mentioned, media texts and objects in his portion of the presentation. Specifically, students will engage in transmedia navigation and judgment through a content analysis. Transmedia navigation, as defined by Jenkins and his colleagues, is the ability to follow the flow of stories and information across multiple modalities. And judgment is the ability to evaluate the reliability and credibility of different information sources. So for this portion of the course, students will contribute advertising content that depicts the planet or Earth in some way. And we have amassed over 60 print advertisements and over 25 video commercials that depict the environment. I'll show you the prompt now that I give them. For this task, they read a chapter from Julia Courbet's Communicating Nature. And it's important for them to note that they're not looking for counter ads or public service announcements. Students have a deep misunderstanding of what it means to select an ad that represents the Earth. They immediately think of ads that encourage them to use less paper towels or to drive less. But when we look at media objects, we're looking at how the Earth is portrayed and represented as a piece of the story, but the story is not about the Earth in those ads. So if I go back again, you can see, for instance, in the lower left corner, there is a allergy medicine ad that says "Defy Nature," and the woman is kind of staring down the flower. Or in the Tide ad in the top middle, we see the rainbow and the beautiful cloud scene, but the ad is not about that rainbow and clouds, it's about the product. And so this transmedia navigation and judgment is to follow the flow of how the Earth is represented in commercial media content holistically, which is a unfamiliar practice for students. The next thing we'll do is dig deeper into what Antonio previewed for us with regards to the extraction, the geological extraction, and the physical development of our devices through materials from the earth through a collective intelligence activity that I call the EcoMedia Jigsaw. Collective intelligence involves the ability to pool knowledge and compare notes with others towards a common goal. For this activity, I'll divide students into 3 groups. One group will engage in readings about conflict minerals and the heavy extraction of minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo, primarily, that end up in our technology devices. The second group will read materials related to the cloud. And I have in the puzzle piece there a photograph of the cover of Bruce Barcott's The Last Flight of the Scarlet Macaw, which isn't directly about cloud power, but it's about the impact of hydropower in a community in Belize. And so we make that connection through that text. The last piece is about e-waste, electronic waste, and the impacts on communities, particularly in Ghana and China. And students will read and prepare themselves as experts in these 3 groups, and then we come together in class, and that's when they engage in pooling knowledge. That shifts the responsibility from my shoulders as the teacher to the student's shoulders, and is another aspect of a decolonizing pedagogy. We also engage in play. Play is so essential, even for undergraduate students. And Jenkins and his colleagues define play as the capacity to experiment with one's surroundings as a form of problem solving. And I've used a variety of different kinds of play in the classroom. We've done some concept mapping with text and positioning on the page, as you see in the left side of the slide. But then I've also tried to support them through materials like puzzle pieces, by providing them with images and other kinds of content that they can clip and collage, in addition to inviting them to explore some painting and using their hand as a metaphor for understanding their relationship and responsibility to the topics that we are exploring. And so this happens as part of the Eco Jigsaw assignment, in addition to at other points when I intersperse lecture into their learning. The capstone, or kind of culmination, of our work was inspired by Bigelow and Swinehart's People's Curriculum for the Earth. And what I've done is I've adapted their Indigenous Peoples Summit, which addresses more standard climate crisis related issues that we might think of when we conjure up issues related to the climate crisis. So for example, he has scenarios related to flooding, food reduction, and contamination of water. What I've done in this People's Summit is encourage students to engage in performance and play. We discussed play already, but performance is the ability to adopt alternative identities for the purpose of improvisation and discovery. So through the People's Summit, we move towards problem solving. You see our Marshall Islands poet, Kathy Jetnell-Kilner, in the upper right corner. I will structure this conference scenario where students come to class and I ask them how their flight was. And they immediately are immersed in this role play, having just arrived to my classroom from China or Ghana or another location to engage in this summit. And we listen to Kathy Jetnell-Kilner's poem, Tell Them, as a keynote and as a way to start embodying the realities that they are about to explore. I've created 4 new scenarios. I use the Yupik people scenario from Bigelow and Swinehart so that they can arrive into the class as arriving in Alaska. So we role play that we're at the University of Anchorage in Alaska. And so there's a foundational group of students that are American, pass out name tags, as you might have seen in this picture, with flags taped to it to help, again, create that conference feel. The 4 scenarios that I've created are the river basin in Brazil, the DRC, Accra, Ghana, and Gayu, China. And what I distribute to students in these groups is 1 page, a scenario that they can read, take notes on, and then work into a first-person account so they can begin to embody the experience. And then they will rotate so that each group is able to share with another group. And again, that piece follows the curricular flow follows Bigelow and Swinehart if you want to learn more about that role play flow. But for our purposes, we are calling it the digital climate crisis, and students are exploring these particular issues. We again then come together after this role play, and students engage in collective intelligence through problem solving. Again, pooling their knowledge, comparing notes towards a common goal. So I ask them as these individual groups to identify what are the two problems they want the rest of the world to know about what their people are facing in this digital climate crisis? And then what are two action solutions that they want to bring to the UN? And we puzzle this all out on the whiteboard or large paper, and students come up with some very creative solutions. In the past, they have suggested definitely taxing electronics. They've suggested visibility campaigns, much in the same way that tobacco was required to put large stickers on their products. They suggest large stickers on our electronic products so that when you buy them, you see the firsthand experiences of communities that have to deal with the e-waste, for example. They've thought very much outside of the box and suggested looking for new alternative materials to create resources, 3D printing and other kinds of chemical solutions so that we can create disposable plastics that biodegrade, for instance. Awareness is always one that pops up, awareness campaigns, and they themselves always leave the course saying that they had no idea, they've never thought about where their devices come from or where they go. And then finally, the last piece that I've tried at different points, but it takes a lot more runway to move students from concept to production when we do video work, but I've done some remix. Jenkins calls it appropriation in his work. I prefer the term remix because students are taking advertisements that depict a number of ecological related issues and they're pulling out a counter narrative. They're kind of flipping the script on these texts, and they do it in small groups. I have one to share, but in the interest of time, we'll likely move to discussion instead, but you can see the images on the slide. We have Fiji's Earth's Finest Water. This is from a 15-second ad that ran during the Super Bowl, and that basically just says bottled water and plastic is awesome for everybody on the planet. And students will remix this whole 15-second spot with a new voiceover, new music, and then they Photoshop the ad. So here it says contaminating Earth's water, just subtle changes. And this has certainly been part of media literacy practice for a long time, but applying it in the eco-literacy context is rather new. So concluding thoughts for the action piece, eco-media literacy and media literacy align through a common focus on decoding the roots of cultural ideologies and beliefs through critical thinking and action. And further, by integrating these topics into a college level media lit course, and pushing my own pedagogical practice, I invite my students as millennials to become active participants in social discourse related to the Anthropocene and climate crisis. We'll move now to the discussion. I do apologize if I spoke too fast. I really want us to have a chance to talk about these issues, and we can revisit any of the components of the presentation or any of the activities I shared at this time. So it's 1:47. Jeff said we had a little extra time. So I think that gives us at least 15 minutes for a nice discussion, perhaps a little longer.
Great. So maybe we could start with the question that's already in the chat, and it's to you, Theresa.
Okay, great.
Asks, are you able to do the role play conference digitally? If so, what are the differences in learning?
Thanks for the question.
People could also just put questions in the chat.
Yeah,
so
please do.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
we can use the chat and our video and audio simultaneously. I didn't do the role play this past spring. With the shift to online, the pivot online with COVID, I lost some curricular time. And so I haven't tried it yet, but as I prepare this spring, I'd like to try the role play. And I did email the folks at Zoom and say, look, students have to be able to choose breakout rooms. And I don't think I was alone because now they have rebooted and you can enable students to choose breakout rooms. So hopefully I can create a scenario where they can move through in a way that's similar to what we did in class. It will be a learning experience.
Yeah, I'm planning on doing the same activity with the role play, and I will put students into breakout rooms and then just switch it up a little bit and just see how that works. You know, it's not ideal, but it can be done.
Yeah, I would just want to add to that. I like the solution-oriented approach because this information can be really heavy for people and they kind of turn off if it's too much. So I use this reverse curriculum design process where at the beginning of the class, I say, by the end of the course, we want to answer this question. What kind of healthy eco-media system can we create in order for people to be better informed and for us to better take action to solve these problems. So that there's always this idea that there's a way to solve this through as we go tackle each thing throughout the course. I think it's really important to understand that we're wired to turn off to bad news, and people just want to run away and not deal with it. So we always have to be offering some kind of solutions approach.
I'll tack on there, pulling the thread from what Antonio just shared back to Pamela's question, that I did do some EcoMedia Literacy work with an asynchronous graduate course a few years ago. And that's where the heaviness, they did email me and they shared that it was hard. They felt like they were in a dark place in that particular course, in that unit, and we didn't have an active synchronous component. And I think that that's essential to have that connection, that human connection for this work.
I'm currently teaching an environmental justice course online. And one of the things that we try to focus on, just because it can be so heavy and depressing, is biophilia, the love of nature, getting them to reflect on their histories, their experiences with nature, and really kind of bringing in what are all the positive values we've learned and we know, and we can find in others and other cultures, indigenous ways of seeing.
Ralph has an interesting question. So I bring in the Luddites into all my work. So, and what I do in talking about the Luddite critique of technology is, well, I make the point, first of all, that they were not anti-technology, but were anti the dehumanization through technology. And so what I then ask is, can we have like an environmental friendly or human friendly form of technology? I'm not, I have a lot of friends and colleagues in the eco environmental who see technology sort of the root evil. I don't really take that position, but I definitely try to problematize as much as possible, and also try to be very reflective and self-aware. Like even if we have to teach a class remotely online, to make people aware that streaming, all these different things have this environmental impact. So that's kind of how I deal with it.
To help answer the question, I just popped an opinion piece from the Washington Post into the chat that came out this past February. And we had a small digital conference on our campus, and I used some of this in my keynote there. And the suggestion is that this particular community examines, before they adopt a new technology, the impact. What is the impact? What is the reach? And Neil Postman says that technology is like ecological. It's not an added benefit or an added negative. It just changes everything fundamentally. So he compares it to introducing caterpillars to a new environment. Like, you can't necessarily anticipate their impact, but it will change everything. And so I think this article kind of facilitates that kind of thinking. What are the possible outcomes?
Theresa, thanks. You made me think of something that I think is also important, which is a lot of what you saw in this presentation today is a critique of modernity.
Yeah.
So a lot of sort of the root thought, the root worldview that's causing a lot of this destruction is in how we separate ourselves from nature. And there are a lot of interesting innovations going on with like biomimicry. There's all kinds of people working on biochemistry, different things that are meant to be more harmonious with the environment. And one of the things that I try to problematize is some of these sort of what are called eco-modernist solutions, which is that you don't really change the mentality, you just find a new technology to fix the problem, which I'm really against. In other words, geoengineering, these kind of things. So, but I think it's good to introduce eco-modernity to the students and have them talk about that and see, ask them, do you think that we can invent technologies to solve these problems, or do we have to really go deeper, like the iceberg model that Jeff showed us, and look at the really underlying structures of how we apply these technologies?
Any other questions?
By the way, it would be nice to actually hear people's voices. So please, I think people can speak up.
Okay, I'm gonna do that then.
Good, thank you.
So this was really fascinating presentations. Thank you very much. And the way that they all like speak to each other. I unfortunately in the US, climate change and like humans' impact on climate change is politicized. Does that ever creep into your classroom conversations about this? Like, how do you negotiate different, the different ideologies that your students are maybe coming in with?
It's a really good question.
Well, I think part of what I was trying to do is show, kind of make visible so much of this deep embedded ideology that has historical context, that we can see specifically how these things happened. I mean, to me, just that image of Pan, the Greek god, is like, I had no idea when I first discovered that's where we got the idea of the devil. How messed up is that? And so if we can start to see how these processes have played out and to shape what we have now, that nothing's just normal or natural, that all of these are social constructs. And the more we can understand the construction process, I think the more power we have to then decide what we want to think.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching in North Carolina, well, I'm not from North Carolina, but I've been here 9 years now, and I haven't encountered resistance from students based on this idea of the politicization of the climate crisis. And perhaps that's because the ecological impacts of media, Antonio in his work talks about the media mind print, and then the physical digital impacts of physical digital devices. And I think because they haven't encountered it, they're almost maybe in shock, perhaps. And so they don't push back against it. They're almost more overwhelmed by it as something new, and they rarely encounter much new information in their curriculum holistically.
Yeah, and I start my first week, almost the first class, I just lay out the science of global heating. I have some charts, like I have them read this Rolling Stone article by Bill McKibben about the parts per million, what do you call it? The CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere, and we have to get down to 350, and now we're up at 410 parts per million. And they just read that and it blows their minds. So there's a couple of basic scientific facts that you could just show them really quickly. It just sort of sets the table, and we're all on the same page. I tell them that I don't debate the science in the course, that I'm taking this as fact. However, what we're going to look at is the way that the issues around the climate are then constructed in the media and in political discourses, and then we spend the rest of the course dealing with that. And then I always show the climate deniers discourses so they understand how those arguments are constructed, and then I show sort of counter discourses. But I always show them the language of climate denial so they understand how it works. So I spend a lot of time looking at metaphors and language and discourse.
It's super helpful. Thank you.
We have a new question in the chat, and I just want to shout out Benjamin because he has a fantastic piece he has a text-based article in addition to a podcast that he's shared in our special issue. So if you came late and you roll up to the top of the chat, Antonio, Jeff, and I co-edited an issue of the journal Sustainability Education, and you definitely got to check out Ben's article because he does some really cool embodiment exercises with his students. But I'll let someone else field this.
You should put that link in again, because if you come late, you don't see it.
Okay, thanks. I'll do that right now. Thanks for that.
I like the question that Ben poses. I think it's really important. And I think one of the big things to do is try to unpack some of the myths that we have in our dominant culture. And one of them is this myth of universal vulnerability, that we're all going to be equally impacted by the climate crisis. And that's not the case. We all will be affected in some ways, but the people who are typically the poorest and most marginalized, like always, will be the worst impacted, and they already are. And we're seeing this in island nations. We're seeing this, in poor communities, where the impact of whatever the environmental problem is just far, far more drastic and detrimental. And those tend to be the people who are least responsible for contributing to the problem.
So one thing that I do with my students is I talk about environmental ideology as a spectrum, from anthropocentric to ecocentric, and then there's sort of in-between positions. And because one of the things that we have to get them to unlearn, and this is, I think Theresa talked about this, is that when they think environmentalist, they think environmental, then automatically is something that's good. So what I try to tell them is that an environmental ideology is not a normalization ideology. It's just a position of either you see nature as intrinsic or you see nature as instrumental. And then there's various different positions like preservationism, conservationism, animal rights, ecofeminism, deep ecology, indigenous perspective. They all have different positions uh, in this place because what they tend to think is that ecocentric is anti-human. And what we try to, and I think the graphic that Jeff showed us, what we're trying to say is that no, humans are in equal relationship with these other aspects of our reality. It's just that we're not on top of the pyramid. So it really takes a lot of work to get them to unthink this idea that when you start talking about ecocentric, that you're somehow being anti-human. At the same time, I think if I understand Benjamin's question correctly, is that we do also tend to overemphasize the human in liberal arts, in humanities, in we center the human. So what we want to do is not eliminate the human, but decenter the human. So I think we're trying to extend the ethics to not just other human beings, but extend ethics to the land, extend ethics to plants, animals, and if you want to go this far, to the spirit world as well.
I think, Antonio, in Greening Media Education, you say at some point you are a medium for the earth spirit. I might not be quoting it exactly correctly, but I used that in the class with our conference. And for those who get it, I think that is helpful for them to understand that their own embodiment in the world is a medium, the way they embody their own.
Yeah, and I also try to get students to think about it's like we're not trying to heal the earth. We are the earth we are part of the earth trying to heal the earth. It's not us trying to do something to the earth. And there's this great idea that comes from the anthropologist, I'm forgetting his name, but he talks about the difference between spheres and globes. So globe is an object that you separate yourself from, and a sphere is something that you're within. So we want to sort of get away from this idea of the earth as a globe, as sort of this object that we're always doing something to reframing it so that we're in that, we're part of that, we are extensions of it, we're in the atmosphere, we're part of the atmosphere, we're part of the earth. It's not something separate from us. And again, this goes back to the worldview we inherited from modernity. And it's just so difficult to unlearn these things. It's just, you just have to keep working on it over and over and over again.
Oh, that's come up before, Benjamin, definitely. Yes.
Benjamin is asking if something about revising the core principles of NAMLI. I'm all for it. Michelle, if you want to put me on the committee, let me know.
Yeah. And Alex has also put a question in the chat. I'm still reading it.
People can speak up. I'd like to hear your voice. Who Alex, you want to say your question?
Yeah, these are big questions. I don't know if your microphone's working, so I'm happy to read them for the group. Alex is a high school science teacher in Los Angeles, and he's wondering, given capitalism's role in subverting nature, can capitalism be leveraged to save nature moving forward? Should we instead look to government intervention to solve environmental exploitation? In your view, what is the best modern tool to use? Before folks dig in, I'll just reference Antonio just shared that maybe we don't save nature. We're probably the least of the Earth's concerns. It will be here long after us. But let's see what do folks think. It's a tough one.
Well, I would. It's a mix. You have to do different things. It's kind of like the way this election is going. Maybe some people don't agree with Biden as their choice, but they know that they have to be strategic in how they vote in order to move forward with certain policies. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to have regulation of business. These businesses are not going to just disappear overnight. we have to transform the economy. We have to transform our democracy. And sort of the transition is that we have to step in, and the government has to have a much stronger role in stimulating alternative energy, building an alternative energy grid, and global governments have to start reducing the amount of, forcing by law the amount of pollution, the use of plastics. Companies have to get reformed, but I would say probably the everyone should work on the thing that's most important to them. But getting corruption out of politics is one of the most important things we could do, because you can see that, like, under the last 4 years with Trump, so many environmental policies got undone because of the ability of fossil fuel interests to take over the government and even Supreme Court. So this is really important. This is something we need to deal with until we transition to the much bigger, we're still 20 years away from a new clean energy system. And how do we get to that point? There's some great videos, by the way, on Intercept that Naomi Klein worked on, and Molly Crabapple. You should watch these videos. They kind of give you sort of a vision, like, how do we get to this place where we fix all of our problems? They're really neat.
I'll put the first one in the chat. I think it's Message from the Future.
Yeah, and then the second one just came out about a week or two ago, and it's also really powerful. And they're short, they're animated, they're very accessible. It's something you could share with students, probably from elementary on up, depending how you use it. And they're really a great look at what they're trying to kind of reimagine and get us to recognize. Number one is that we're all connected, and that these issues to the environment are social justice issues that affect everybody. And so it should be part of Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, all the different movements. We need to recognize that we're all connected, especially through the environmental crisis. And then they give you a positive vision. It's not dystopic. It's meant to show kind of a solar punk idea of what we can do if we make the changes now.
Speaking of solar punk, there's an article in our issue about solar punk, which is sort of utopian science fiction that sort of envisions how we solve problems. By the way, I would just say that, as a starting point, the Green New Deal, it's not perfect, but that's kind of like a concept that people can rally around and something we can work on as we transition our systems. So in the long run, I don't think capitalism is going to do it, but we're in the capitalist society at the moment, so we have to work within the parameters of the system and transform it over time.
I want to be sensitive to everyone's time and invite folks if you have to sign off. Otherwise, we'll hang out a little longer if you do have additional questions. Thanks, Alex. Bye, Michelle.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you all. It was so inspiring to be presented with all of these new and super awesome ideas, and it helps definitely fuel my work, and thinking about how this also needs to be approached and what I'm doing, with teachers, etc. One of the things that I keep thinking about is that how unpopular, you can't, being political, it's easier to be political if you're a college professor. It's harder to be political if you're conducting professional development, for instance. And also, like when you're teaching media literacy to, whatever, PD for high school educators, that you really can't push your viewpoint too much, because then we don't want to model that these teachers are going to be pushing their viewpoint to their students, because the process is about asking questions, yet you want to present it as a topic, right? Like, this is something to explore. And, how do you make it more accessible to, to the middle school level, to the high school level? Education, because I definitely see a fit for sure that these conversations are happening at higher levels, and so my thoughts have been like, how can I, how could this be more accessible to a younger audience, you know? Yeah, thanks.
That's a great point. Thank you. And I think this is another reason to start with the love of nature and start with people finding those connections that they can make and value, right? And there we can build, and then we can start posing new questions and a little problem posing and a little, guidance.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and Pamela, it's so great to see you. It's been a long time.
Yeah, same here.
I mean, again, you're right. I'm in Italy. I don't have to deal with any controversy about climate change. Everyone gets it here. Europe is, doing their own Green New Deal. So we're in a different place in the US. And most of my students, it's not a question for them. So I understand. I'm sensitive to your concern. I don't know if this is helpful for you, but like I was saying before, I kind of start with the basics, with the science, just talk about, what just how a system works, and and I even talk like about a bank account. I say, what happens if I have $1,000 in my bank account, but I spend 2,000? How do I pay for that? And I said, well, the environment is like that, right? You can't extract more than what it regenerates. And so I go through like, what are the different limits that we have? Limits on that the planet has finite amount of material, and that you can show them that, United States consumes 4 Earths, and you ask them who's going to pay for that. Like, you're borrowing against the future. This is our grandchildren or great grandchildren are going to pay for that. And I try to go about it without being political, just sort of talking about the facts about, what the Earth, what we have as what's the word, biodiversity, and about, resources, all these different things that we need to live our lives. And then what happens if you take too much of it? And they get that. So you can even bring it on the local level and try to think of like its house, talk about water, or talk about something that is very tangible to them. And, talk about what happens when you take too much of this. Where does it come from? Where you bring in the water for your fields or for the acequia, things like that. Or even talk about acequias as sort of a system of environmental management and things like that.
I'll add on, you're working with pre-service or in-service teachers or both?
Mainly in-service teachers. Yeah.
I haven't done this particular EcoMedia Literacy unit with my in-service or pre-service teachers here at App State yet, but our pre-service teachers do tend to be predominantly white, predominantly female, predominantly Christian, and more conservative than our other students. And so those are issues. And so I can't speak from direct experience, but I did suggest the participatory culture piece helps. As Antonio said, making connections to things that they already are on board with, like the idea of the banking example. The other piece is, Annie Leonard had the Story of Stuff, the animation that came out in like 2006. And there's a short clip, like 3 minutes, where she talks about planned and perceived obsolescence. And she uses the example of women's shoes going from skinny to fat heel sizes each year. And I've started using that to pull from our advertising unit into EcoMedia Literacy with the undergraduate students. And I will share after that clip examples of iPhone products, related products, going back to the original iPhone, and then we do the shuffles and the nanos and all the stuff. And we talk about the differences between planned, perceived, and then we have the single-use products. And I think that's something that's not been politicized and it's not on their radar. And so there's a real strong like entryway where they can come across this threshold. And then I've found them to be more receptive after crossing that threshold. So that might be an idea. And I know you do work with advertising already, but to look at planned and perceived, because they're the ones putting those bills too, especially if they're in-service teachers and they have kids.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for your ideas.
One of the things that, hi, thank you all. This has been really, really interesting, especially around, as I said, the language issues. So I teach college. I teach right now. I'm teaching our foundation in media theory, history, and production class. And so these are all students who are aspiring media makers. And a few years ago, I started integrating sort of an eco-media thread into my teaching. And I'm wanting to deepen it because the students who love the tech and love the tools and are also socially committed and very enlightened. And they're, this is, we're on the left coast. So they're already there as far as a lot of these ideas, but there's a huge contradiction in them doing production work and using these tools that are actually really damaging. And and the pressure to keep learning the new tools and buying into the new, the new version of whatever, it also is hugely stressful on just the maker. Like the producer has to always be teaching themselves the new thing. And so I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts on those aspects. It's a little bit different than the media literacy piece, but it is part of media literacy is actually producing it and producing it consciously.
I think production can be very simple. I mean, it doesn't have to be elaborate. It doesn't have to be the newest tools. I mean, production could be performance. It could be just using your cell phone. There's so many ways that we can make production accessible, as long as our focus is not on the final product as much as on the process. Because education, we need to keep going back. It's about the process.
Well, and that's what we're faced with in the pandemic too, because we're teaching remotely. So they're basically producing with what they've got. And that's been actually a really nice thing, is to kind of encourage them to think about how to create their home studio and their, do what they can with what they've got. Yet there's still this pressure when they graduate, they're looking for work. There's still this pressure to kind of conform to the capitalist planned obsolescence, media empire stuff. And so that's, so we've been teaching this sort of alternative media production mode for a long time at the Evergreen State College. And we've been doing this for a long time, the sort of oppositional, experimental, all this kind of stuff. But they still have to deal with this when they graduate, if they're interested in going into that field professionally.
I always say you have to use what's available. So if you want to change the system, you still have to work within the system. I think Indigenous people know this very well. Like if they realize that if they want to engage the white world, let's say, they have to learn the legal language and all these different things. The tools that oppress them are the tools that they have to use to change their situation. In the same way, the production of our tools are horrible, and the conditions that people have to make these under are absolutely awful. But to participate in society, we have to use the tools. That's the contradiction. So I think first we name the problem, and then after naming the problem, then people can hopefully put pressure on these industries to try to change the practices or change laws, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel like if we abandon all these tools, we wouldn't be able to do anything at all. We have to find a way to first meet each other, see each other, talk to each other, try to solve these problems. And for now, what we have, these tools are what make this possible.
Great, thank you.
The only thing I'd add to this kind of quandary, Ruth, is to follow up on what Jeff said, that the purpose is the process. And I've recently gotten into arts-based inquiry and using visual journaling in my media literacy class as a production process, because cramming in some kind of production opportunity into that already overpacked curriculum when they get one media literacy course in their life, if they're lucky, and certainly only one in the minor, was too challenging. We spent too much on the technical how-to. They needed to know how to work Adobe Premiere or how to work with the microphones, the lighting kits. And so to just do the visual journaling piece brings them into the creative process. And one thing that might be of use is if they're putting pressure on you, or if there's pressure related to the professional world that they want to go into of broadcast or media making, would be potentially to dig into the research on creativity, because some of that research suggests that the creative thinking that's behind those productions is some of the hardest work to do, and the technical stuff comes relatively easily later. There's so many tutorials, for instance. So my partner teaches all production courses, and he's doing it all online right now. And he's doing a lot of remix, a lot of collaborative editing and audio production. And they're using what they've got, recording on phones, but going in the closet so their audio is better, things like that.
Yeah, thank you. So we're an experimental college, so I'm teaching them full time, and we're co-teaching. So I have about 30 students, and we meet with them 12 to 15 hours a week. So we have more leeway. It's more luxurious in terms of the times that we can carve up and stuff. Yeah, these are all really great. And yeah, and I agree, the creativity part is actually the most important thing that we do. So thank you.
So I just want to say something because I think some of us are going to have to leave soon, especially me. There's obviously greater interest in this than there was in the past, so I'm really happy about that. And it seems to me that there needs to be more discussion about how do we share resources, how do we professional development, how do we train each other, and how do we keep having this conversation? Except, I mean, we meet once a year at a conference. It's not enough. So maybe we could all start thinking about ways to meet more regularly and also to develop. I would love to see some kind of website where, like, Teresa could share her archive of imagery that her students collect. I have all these videos that I'm collecting that we use for analysis in my classes. Jeff has a ton of stuff, and then all of you guys would be finding stuff. So I've imagined at some point there should be like an ecomedialiteracy.org website where we just share and connect and communicate. And if anyone knows of a grant or support for something like this, let us know, because I think that all of us are ready for it, and the media literacy movement is ready for it. It needs it. So I just want to plant that seed. Be a good permaculture gardener here.
It's
Use
a good time
natural
too.
soils. What?
I said it's a good time too, because I think that one of the issues I'm having at my university is with the shift online. There was a huge buying effort. They wired all the classrooms. They got those owls. They purchased all this. It was like, we can solve it by buying more tech. And I've already shared, my little voice in some corners of my scholarly community and run into some resistance. I think it's hard for people without having read Antonio's work or been in a class with Jeff Scher to understand these issues. They don't perceive technology as coming from anywhere. It's just there. Buy it. You'll be a great teacher. Sorry.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and another session starts soon. These are great ideas, and please contact us if you want to be involved. I'm sure Antonio eats, breathes this all the time. So if we can everybody interested in working with us, please send us an email and we'll try to start building something. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Teresa. Thanks, everyone. It's great to see everyone. I appreciate all your comments. Bye.
Thank you.